The advertisement had been printed on a thin piece of paper, slightly smudged at the edges, as if it had been passed through too many hands before finally reaching her. It wasn't fancy. No logo, no promises of comfort, just a simple line written in plain, firm words. Cook needed for private ranch. Long-term stay. Food and lodging provided. Must be reliable. That was it. No name, no details, no picture of the ranch. Nothing that would normally make someone trust it. But she wasn't in a position to be picky anymore. Life had already taken more than it had given. She stood at the small bus stop outside the edge of town, holding a worn bag that contained everything she owned. The wind moved just across the empty road, and the sky looked endless to wide, to quiet, like it was watching her decide whether she was brave or foolish. A few weeks earlier, she had lost her last steady job at a roadside diner. Rent had followed soon after. Then the landlord's warning. Then the final night in a borrowed room. After that, there had only been movement, walking, waiting, searching for something that didn't fall apart as soon as she touched it. The ranch job had been the first thing that didn't disappear when she looked at it twice. So she went. The ride out of town took longer than she expected. The bus stopped running halfway, leaving her to continue on a shared wagon that rattled along dirt roads lined with dry grass and scattered trees. The farther she went, the less civilization felt real. Phone signals faded. Buildings disappeared. Even sound seemed to thin out, replaced by wind and the distant call of birds she didn't recognize. By the time she finally saw the ranch, the sun was already dipping low. It wasn't what she imagined. There were no welcoming signs, no workers laughing in the fields, no smoke rising from a busy kitchen. Instead, there was silence. White, heavy silence stretched across acres of land. A large wooden house stood near the center, withered but strong, like it had been built to survive years of solitude rather than comfort. And beyond it, fences, stables, and open land that disappeared into the horizon. She stepped down slowly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. The wagon driver didn't say much, only nodded once before turning away, as if he was relieved to leave. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she heard footsteps. Not hurried, not casual, measured. A man emerged from the side of the house. He was tall, dressed in simple work clothes, sleeves rolled up, hands steady and marked by labor. He didn't smile. He didn't rush to greet her. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and looked at her as if measuring whether she belonged there. His eyes were calm but unreadable. "You're the cook," he said finally. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "I answered the notice." A pause followed, the kind that made time feel heavier than it should. Then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the house. "You'll work in the kitchen, meals at sunrise and sunset. No wandering after dark. Stay on the property unless I say otherwise." His voice was firm, controlled, like someone who was used to being obeyed without discussion. She should have felt uneasy, maybe even afraid, but strangely, what she felt was something else. Curiosity. Because even though his words were strict, his tone wasn't cruel. It didn't carry anger. It carried something closer to habit. Like these rules weren't meant to control her, but to keep something under control inside himself. "I understand," she said quietly. He studied her for another second, then nodded once. Good. That was the end of the introduction. He turned and walked toward the house, expecting her to follow. And she did, but as she stepped inside, she felt it immediately. The house wasn't just large. It was empty in a way that felt emotional, not physical, like it had been lived in once, fully and warmly, but had slowly forgotten how. The kitchen, however, was prepared. Clean counters, fresh supplies, everything arranged with precision, as if he had been waiting for her longer than he would admit. She placed her back down and looked around. "You'll start tomorrow," he said from the doorway. "Tonight, you rest." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone again, leaving her alone in a place that already felt like it was holding secrets in every corner. That night, as she lay in a small room overlooking the ranch, she couldn't sleep. Not because she felt unsafe, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt something she couldn't explain. Like this job wasn't just about cooking. Like she hadn't just arrived at a ranch. Like she had stepped into the beginning of something she didn't yet understand, but wouldn't be able to walk away from easily. Morning came slowly over the ranch, as if even the sun hesitated before touching the land. Pale light spilled across the wooden fences, the empty yard, and the long shadows of the main house. Everything felt still, too still for a place where people were supposed to live. Inside the kitchen, she woke early. Not because anyone called her. No bell rang. No footsteps came to her door. It was the silence itself that pulled her awake, as if the house had its own rhythm and expected her to follow it. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and stepped into the kitchen. Everything was exactly as it had been the night before. Clean, organized, waiting. But she wasn't alone for long. Footsteps again. The same rhythm she had heard yesterday. He entered without announcing himself. Same man, same expression, same controlled presence that made the room feel slightly smaller when he was inside it. He paused just inside the doorway, looking at her work area. "You're early," he said. "I wanted to start properly," she replied. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable but heavy, like something unspoken sat between them. He walked to the counter and placed a small notebook there. Opened it. Pointed to a list written in neat, precise handwriting. "These are the meals I expect. Nothing complicated. No waste. Everything should be consistent." She glanced at it. The list wasn't harsh. It was simple, basic, even. Bread, stews, coffee, fresh vegetables. Nothing extravagant. But the way it was written felt intentional. Like routine was important here in a way she didn't yet understand. "I can do this," she said. He nodded. Once, then turned slightly as if preparing to leave. But she spoke again before she could stop herself. "You live here alone?" The question hung in there instantly. He stopped. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see part of his face in the morning light. "Yes," he said. That was all. No explanation, no story, no emotion, just a fact. And then he left the kitchen again. As the morning passed, she worked. The kitchen slowly came alive under her hands, water boiling, bread warming, the scent of simple food filling spaces that had probably been silent for too long. She noticed things as she worked. The way the cupboards were stocked, not just neatly, but carefully. The way nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt unused in a personal way. It wasn't just a house. It was a place someone had learned to live in without living in it fully. Around midday, she saw him again, outside this time. He was near the stables, checking fences, his movements steady and practiced. He worked like someone who didn't need help and didn't expect it either. But there was something repetitive about his actions, like he was keeping himself busy on purpose. She watched him from the kitchen window for a moment longer than she meant to. He didn't look up. It was as if he always knew where everything was, even without seeing it. By late afternoon, she had finished preparing the first full meal of the day. She set the table carefully, unsure if he expected formal service or simple placement. He entered without hesitation, sat down, looked at the food, then at her. "You followed instructions," he said. "Yes." He ate slowly, not rushed, not distracted, controlled, like everything else about him. She sat across from him, unsure if she was supposed to eat at the same time or wait. Eventually, she began, quietly, watching his reactions more than her own plate. He didn't speak much while eating, but she noticed something subtle. He didn't avoid her presence. He didn't ask her to leave, and when she accidentally moved a spoon too loudly against the plate, he didn't react at all. But his eyes, those brief, quiet glances, suggested he was aware of everything. After the meal, he stood up immediately. No lingering, no conversation. But as he reached the doorway, he paused again. "You can use the garden behind the kitchen," he said without turning fully around. "If you need herbs," then he added, after a short hesitation, "don't go beyond the fence at the far side," and then he was gone. That evening, as she cleaned the kitchen, she found herself thinking about him more than she expected. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind either. He was contained, like someone who had built walls, not to keep people out, but to keep something inside from escaping. And the strangest part was this. Even though he barely spoke, she felt like he was watching everything, not in a threatening way, but in a deeply aware way. Like he noticed details others missed. The way she measured ingredients, the way she paused before answering, the way she moved quietly through spaces that felt too large for one person. And she realized something she couldn't quite explain. Yet, this wasn't just a job where she cooked for a stranger. She had stepped into a place where silence itself was part of the household. And the man who owned this ranch wasn't just silent. He was deliberately quiet, as if every word he didn't say was protecting something she had not yet seen. The second morning arrived with even less sound than the first. There were no birds near the house, or at least none she could hear. The wind moved across the open land in slow waves, brushing against wooden walls and dry grass like it didn't want to disturb anything. It felt like the ranch existed in its own agreement with silence, one she was still learning how to respect. She woke before sunrise again, Not out of fear this time, but habit. The kitchen had started to feel familiar. In a strange way, as if it had been waiting for someone to give it purpose again. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began preparing breakfast without needing instruction. By the time the first light touched the windows, she had already started cooking. That was when he appeared, as always, without announcement. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, not in a way that interrupted, but in a way that measured. "You adjust quickly," he said. She didn't turn around immediately. "I had to." A pause, then footsteps. He entered further into the kitchen, this time carrying a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter. "I have rules," he said. She looked at him now. There was no hostility in his voice, no softness either, just structure. He unfolded the paper. "This is how the house runs." She glanced down. The list was short but precise. Meals at sunrise and sunset, kitchen must remain clean at all times, no wandering beyond marked boundaries, no visitors, quiet hours after dark, no unnecessary questions about personal matters. She read it twice, then looked back up at him. "Are these negotiable?" she asked lightly, testing the edges of his seriousness. They weren't. His expression didn't change. No, the answer was immediate. Not angry, not defensive, just final. A silence followed. But instead of tension, she felt something else building in him again, that familiar emotional distance he wore like a second skin. "I understand structure," she said after a moment. "It helps." That made him pause slightly, just a fraction, as if he hadn't expected agreement so easily. Days began to form a pattern after that. Sunrise, cooking, silence, meals, work outside, sunset, quiet. The ranch functioned like a machine that had learned to survive without noise. And yet, she started noticing contradictions. He enforced rules but rarely watched her break them unless necessary. He insisted on distance but never truly left her alone in the house for long periods. He spoke little, but always responded. If she asked something directly, no matter how brief the answer, it wasn't control. It was restraint. Something carefully maintained. Something fragile underneath. One afternoon, while she was organizing supplies, she found herself humming softly without realizing it. The sound was small, almost nothing. But the moment it left her lips, she felt the shift in the atmosphere. She turned slightly. He was standing at the doorway, watching. He didn't interrupt. He didn't stop her. But his eyes had changed slightly, like the sound had reached somewhere inside him that nothing else had touched. She stopped humming. "Sorry," she said instinctively. He shook his head once. "It's fine." But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he leaned lightly against the doorframe, something he had never done before. A small break in his posture. "You don't have to be silent all the time," she said carefully. His gaze shifted toward the window, not meeting hers fully. "It's easier," he replied. "Easier than what?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less empty, more weighted. "Finally," he said, then remembering too much. That was all. No explanation followed, and she didn't push. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something important in that moment. Some silences weren't about control. They were about survival. As evening approached, they ate dinner together again. This time, the silence at the table wasn't as sharp as before. It was still there but softened, like something between them had begun to loosen, even if neither of them admitted it. She noticed small things now. The way he always sat facing the room, not the wall. The way he checked the windows before dark. The way he paused slightly before leaving any space she was in, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't seem used to sharing space with anyone at all. After dinner, he stood by the doorway again. "You're adjusting well," he said. She smiled faintly. "I think I'm just learning the rhythm here." His eyes lingered on her for a moment, longer than usual. Then he nodded once, but before he left, he added something new. "Don't stay outside after dark." It wasn't just a rule this time. It sounded personal, as if it mattered more than the others. And then he was gone again, disappearing into the evening shadows of the ranch, leaving her alone in the kitchen, but not with silence this time. With curiosity. Because now she was certain of something she hadn't been before. The rules weren't just about running a house. They were about protecting something she hadn't been allowed to see yet. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't only protecting the ranch. He was protecting himself too. By the fourth day, the ranch no longer felt completely unfamiliar. And he still stretched wide and quiet in every direction, still held that strange emptiness that made time feel slower than it should. But now she had started recognizing its rhythm, the way mornings arrived in pale gold light, The way evening settled like a heavy curtain. The way silence itself seemed to have a pattern here. And within that pattern, she was beginning to find small places where she could exist without feeling like an intrusion. She moved through the kitchen with more confidence now, measured ingredients, without hesitation, knew where things belonged without asking. Even the house itself seemed to accept her presence more naturally, like it was slowly remembering how to share space again. But the man of the ranch, the one who owned it, controlled it, lived in it like a shadow carved into structure, remained unchanged on the surface, quiet, controlled, observant. Yet something was beginning to shift beneath that surface. It started with small things. A second glance that lasted slightly longer than necessary. A pause at the doorway that didn't lead to immediate departure. Once, she caught him standing near the kitchen window long after she had finished cleaning, simply watching the light move across the counters. When she turned to look at him, he stepped back as if he had never been there. But she had seen him that afternoon. She prepared a simple meal, nothing from the strict list he had given her, but something close enough to it that she felt confident it wouldn't break his rules. When he arrived, he noticed immediately. "This isn't on the list," he said, though not sharply. "I thought you might like something different," she replied. He studied the plate for a moment, then sat down. That alone felt like a change. He usually accepted routine without variation, but this time, he didn't reject it. He ate quietly. Then, after a long pause, he said, "It's good." 2 words, but they landed heavier than anything he had said before. She didn't smile immediately, unsure if she was imagining the significance of it. But when she looked up, she realized he wasn't joking or dismissing it. He meant it. Later, that evening, the sun dipped lower than usual, painting the ranch in warm orange tones. She stepped outside briefly to carry empty containers toward the storage shed. She remembered his rule. Wandering beyond marked boundaries. She stayed close to the house, but the air outside felt different now, less heavy than before. Like the land itself was beginning to soften. She didn't notice him at first. He was already there, standing near the fence line, not far from the house, still as ever, watching the horizon, not the way he usually watched things, carefully, analytically, but differently. Like he wasn't observing the world, he was remembering it. She hesitated, then walked a few steps closer, staying within the allowed area. "You come out here often?" she asked. He didn't turn immediately. Sometimes. A pause. Then she asked, gently, "What do you look for out there?" This time, he was quiet longer. The wind moved between them, brushing against dry grass. Finally, he said, "Nothing." But his voice didn't match the word, because people who truly looked for nothing didn't stand in one place for so long. That night, something unexpected happened. She was finishing her work in the kitchen when she heard footsteps again, but not the usual controlled rhythm, slower, heavier. He appeared at the doorway without speaking, as usual, but didn't leave immediately after stopping. Instead, he stayed, watching her wash the last of the dishes. "You don't need to clean everything immediately," he said. She glanced over her shoulder. "Old habit." He nodded slightly, then stepped inside the kitchen, something he rarely did without purpose. He didn't sit, didn't approach the table, just stood near the counter, as if unsure of where exactly to place himself in a room he usually avoided occupying for long. "You don't follow rules as strictly as I thought you would," he said. She dried her hands. "You thought I would break them. I thought you would question them more." She considered that. "I did," she said honestly. "At first. And now." She looked at him for a moment. "Now I think they're protecting something," she said. That made him stop completely. Even his breathing seemed to slow. For a brief moment, the controlled structure he always carried felt thinner, not gone, but strained, like her words had touched something he kept tightly sealed. He turned slightly away, as if gathering himself. "You shouldn't assume things," he said, but the firmness in his voice wasn't as sharp as before. "I'm not assuming," she replied quietly. "I'm noticing." The ranch changed after sunset. Not in any obvious way, no visible transformation, no sudden shift, but in how it felt. The air grew heavier, quieter in a different manner than the daytime silence. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but watchful. She noticed it the first night, but by the 5th day, she had learned to recognize it as part of the ranch's rhythm. And yet, that night felt different, restless. She finished her work earlier than usual. The kitchen was already clean, the counters wiped, the stove cooled. Normally, she would have gone straight to her room without hesitation. But something kept her from moving, a feeling she couldn't explain. So she stayed a little longer. Outside, the wind moved slowly across the land, brushing against the house like a distant memory trying to be remembered. Then she heard it. Footsteps. But not inside the house. Outside. She stepped out carefully, closing the door behind her without making noise. The moon was high bright enough to wash the ranch in silver light. Shadows stretched long across the yard, bending around fences and barn edges like they were alive. And there he was, standing beyond the porch. Not near the kitchen, not near the stable. Out in the open, where the land stretched toward the horizon. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, looking outward. Still, too still. She hesitated. He had rules about night movement, no wandering after dark. But he was outside now too, which meant either the rules didn't apply to him, or something had changed. She took a few careful steps forward, stopping at a respectful distance. "Yeah? Out late," she said softly. He didn't respond immediately. For a moment, it seemed like he hadn't even heard her. Then he spoke. "I don't sleep much," simple words. But they carried something deeper. Not explanation, admission. She stayed where she was. The wind moved between them again, cooler now, brushing her sleeves. "What keeps you awake?" she asked after a pause. That question lingered longer than the others she had asked him in recent days. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the far edge of the land, where darkness swallowed the horizon completely. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. Memory, only one word. But it changed the air instantly. She didn't push further. Not because she was afraid, but because she could feel that this was not a topic wrapped in simple explanation. It wasn't something he could list or organize like his rules. It was something he lived with, silently, every day. After a long pause, he finally turned slightly toward her. Not fully, just enough for her to see his profile under the moonlight. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "I know," she replied. Another silence. This one different again. Less structured. More human. Then something unexpected happened. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't repeat the rule. Instead, he looked back at the horizon and said, almost like he wasn't speaking directly to her anymore, "This place used to be louder." She glanced at him. "You mean people?" He nodded once. Yes, that single word carried weight. Not sadness in the dramatic sense, but absence. The kind that lingers after something meaningful has gone. She felt it immediately, not as information, but as emotion sitting quietly in the space between them. For the first time, she realized something important. The ranch wasn't just isolated. It had been emptied, slowly, over time, not physically, emotionally, like life had once been here but had gradually stepped away without announcing its departure. She took a small step closer, not invading his space, just reducing the distance slightly. "Is that why you made all those rules?" she asked carefully. He didn't answer immediately, but his silence this time wasn't avoidance. It was consideration. Then finally, "Yes," a pause. Then quieter. "It keeps things from falling apart." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who controlled every detail of the house, who lived by structure, who spoke in short sentences but carried long silences inside them. And she understood something she hadn't before. The rules weren't about control. They were about prevention. About holding something together that had already started to break once before. The wind shifted again. He finally moved, just slightly, as if preparing to return inside. "You should go back," he said. But this time, it didn't sound like command. It sounded like concern. She nodded slowly. "I will." But before she turned away, she hesitated, then asked one last question. "Do you always stand out here alone?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Yes," a pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, "Until now, that was all." He walked back toward the house first, and she followed, a few steps behind, not as an employee, not as a stranger anymore, but as something in between that neither of them had named yet. And as she looked at his figure ahead of her in the moonlight, she realized something quietly unsettling. The distance between them wasn't disappearing. It was changing shape, and whatever was forming now was no longer just silence. The morning after the midnight encounter felt different. Though nothing on the ranch had visibly changed, the fences were still there. The house still stood in its quiet strength. The wind still moved across the open land the same way it always did. But she noticed something subtle. He didn't appear at the kitchen doorway at his usual time. That alone was unusual. She kept working anyway, preparing breakfast with steady hands, but her attention kept drifting toward the door. The ranch had taught her patience in a strange way, but it had also made her more aware of absence. When he finally arrived, it was later than usual. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there for a moment longer than normal, as if deciding whether to enter at all. Then he stepped inside. "You're late," she said lightly, more curiosity than complaint. "I was checking the north fence," he replied, but something in his tone was different. Less controlled, more tired. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he walked to the counter and looked at the food she had prepared, but didn't touch it immediately. That alone made her pause. He always followed routine, always, but today he seemed slightly detached from it. Finally, he sat, but even then, he didn't eat for a moment. Just looked at the plate. As if it reminded him of something. "You asked me a question last night," he said suddenly. She looked up. "Yes." He hesitated. This hesitation was new. "I gave you part of an answer," he continued. She stayed quiet, waiting. He finally began eating slowly, as if grounding himself before continuing. Then, without looking at her directly, he said, "This ranch wasn't always like this." She didn't respond immediately. She simply listened. He set the fork down briefly, a rare pause in his controlled routine. "There used to be more people here," he said. "Workers, family, noise." He stopped again, like the words themselves were heavy. She didn't interrupt. Then he continued. "Then things changed. Not dramatic, not detailed, just final." She realized he wasn't going to explain everything in a straightforward way. He wasn't that kind of person. He spoke in fragments, pieces, small windows into something much larger, and she understood now that forcing details wouldn't work. So she asked gently, "Is that why you keep everything so structured?" He looked at her for the first time that morning. Not sharply, not guarded, just quietly. "Yes," he said again. "Structure is what remains when everything else leaves." That line stayed in the air longer than the others. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen felt still but not empty. Something had shifted again, not dramatically, but deeply. After a while, he continued, voice louder now. "I stopped trusting change," he admitted. She listened carefully. "People leave. Plans fail. Things don't stay the same no matter how much you try to keep them that way." He paused, then added, almost quieter than before, "So I made rules instead." She felt something shift inside her as he said that. Not pity, not fear, understanding, because now the rules made sense in a way they hadn't before. They weren't just instructions. They were protection against unpredictability, against loss, against history repeating itself. She spoke softly, "But rules can't stop everything." He looked at her again, longer this time. "You're right," he said. That was it. And no argument, and no resistance, just acceptance. A silence followed. But this silence felt different too. Less like distance, more like shared recognition, like both of them were standing on the edge of something they hadn't stepped into yet. After finishing his meal, he stood up slowly, but instead of leaving immediately, he stayed near the counter for a moment. That was unusual. He rarely lingered anywhere. "You adapt quickly," he said finally. "I observe." She replied, a faint pause. Then he said something unexpected. "That's dangerous here." She looked at him. "Why?" He hesitated, and for a brief moment, something unspoken crossed his face. Not warning, not anger, something closer to concern mixed with memory, because noticing things, he said slowly, means you start understanding them. He stopped there. If that was already too much, he turned toward the door. But before leaving, he added something softer than anything he had said before. "Not everything here is meant to be understood quickly." And then he was gone. She stood alone in the kitchen again. But this time, she didn't feel like an outsider inside a silent house. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a story she was slowly being pulled into. And for the first time, she realized something important. He hadn't just hired her for cooking. He had allowed her into his structure, and structure, she was beginning to understand, was all that was holding him together.